Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new edition of Scribble Conversations, where we'll be talking about responsible AI at the enterprise. Now, most people here are familiar with the concept of responsible AI. It means essentially the design, development, and use of technology in a responsible way with trust and safety at the very center, and incorporating principles of fairness, equality, non-discrimination, transparency, accountability, and so forth. There's a growing emphasis on responsible AI around the world. Regulators in the US, UK, China, and the EU are thinking about new regulatory frameworks for responsible AI. And foundational model providers like Google, Anthropic, and the others, OpenAI, are thinking about how to come together to develop these responsible AI frameworks. But what we want to do today in these conversations is to focus on a very specific layer of that tech stack. We want to talk about the enterprise and how responsible AI applies to the enterprise. We want to hear perspectives from leaders, business, technology, and other organizations about how they're thinking about responsible AI, what challenges they're facing, and what practical solutions they can suggest to help people deploy responsible AI. I'd like to introduce the series that we've thought through for this topic on responsible AI. We've split it up into two parts. The first, we're talking about operationalizing responsible AI at the enterprise level through a governance, risk, and compliance framework. And in the second session, we're going to be talking to leaders about how to build effective guardrails through technology. As you can see, we have a whole host of wonderful speakers, and I'm really excited to be hosting these series of conversations. For today, as I mentioned, we're really talking about creating a holistic framework to AI governance. And to do that, we have some very specific agenda items. We want to talk about what trust means in the context of AI governance. We want to talk about how responsible AI applies in the context of privacy, accountability, fairness, and security, in the context of enterprises building their governance frameworks. We want to do a deep dive on privacy and think about how privacy risk management fits into this larger concept of AI governance. And we want to also talk a little bit about what we found based on a review of privacy policies of various foundational model providers. For that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for the day. I'm very excited to be moderating conversation with Debu Chatterjee, who's a CEO at Konfer AI, which again helps with governance, risk, and compliance issues for enterprise companies. He's also had stints at Oracle and ServiceNow. So really excited to have you, Debu. Thank you for joining us. We also have Indra and Venkata, founder and co-founder at Scribble Data. Again, bring a wealth of experience on how they're thinking about organizational processing and technology deployments in the context of advanced AI. So with that, I want to dive right into it. We have a lot, I think, to cover. So I think by way of introductions, I want to start with where we are on this journey of enterprises using AI, right? And I was just reviewing a recent report by Andreessen Horowitz, where they talked about how enterprise CXOs want to use AI and generative AI in particular to be able to build new revenue pipelines, create new modes, build operational efficiencies. But the one thing I think that's top of mind for them is that there are legacy issues, of course, but there is a high degree of accuracy required to deploy these systems in their space. And of course, I think there is the risk of compliance and regulatory issues. So Debu, I'd like to start with you. For me, all of this boils down to one thing, and that's trust. So given your experience, I think working in the GRC space, can you tell us why does trust matter to organizations? And especially when it comes to the current crops of LLMs, GenAI models in particular, my sense, and feel free to disagree, is that we're operating from a trust deficit. It seems like there has been an erosion of trust, and we're hearing about hallucinations and error rates and so on and so forth. So is there a trust deficit? Are we operating from that premise? And what would you say is why is trust important to organizations?
Thank you for bringing up this important question about why trust is important. Essentially, from where our experience has been that in the AI land, it is it's basically an ecosystem. Like there are multiple parts to the AI stuff, right? And the AI is actually trying to make a decision based on your data. But the product through which the AI decisioning is being done could be a product which you either build in your company or you are acquiring from somewhere else. And because that product is making a decision on your behalf, and that decision may actually help a company policy, it may company's revenue, it could help companies marketing, it could various business functions which can be affected by it. The users or the business processes or the business segments need to understand how that entity or how that ecosystem is making how this is making a decision, right? So, and essentially all decision sciences are probabilistic, right? There isn't an exact answer. The probability of it being accurate is very high when it's deployed, but occasionally it can make mistakes, and you need to capture the fact that when mistakes happen or when things don't fall in the nuance of where you're making a decision. For example, it could be an HR application. An HR application is actually trying to assign a resume to a job. And it has to do the resume assessment in the way in which a normal human would do, except that the fact that it can actually do more resumes at a time than HR folks can do, and since it can improve the productivity. But it needs to be transparent in the sense of how is it making the choice of this resume versus that resume. And there has been interesting cases around this area. In fact, in New York recently, people found out that if you change the age from 60 to 50, you actually get called for an interview. And that was basically because the software had a hard-coded rule. This is not even predictive analytics. Actually had a hard-coded rule to prevent people from above a certain age from even coming in for an interview, right? So the trust deficit can exist because people do not know exactly how the decision is being made. So the more transparent you are with the product and how the product is making a decision on behalf, what are the things which are gone in there, like what kind of models you're using, how the model has been trained, what data set has been used, what is the comparable information on which the product was created for you, the better chances you are to earn the trust of the user, as well as the fact that the decision who's making a business function call on top of the decision the product is making for you.
Thank you, Debu. I think that makes a lot of sense. You did mention being transparent as an important element of this, and I do want to come back to that question. Once I get a few thoughts from both Indra and Venkata, given your experience working with enterprise companies, deploying AI in different use cases, some of the risks that Debu mentioned, right? I want to know what that means in terms of a reputational risk or a revenue risk, right? When an error is made, right, through automated decision making, for example. Are these risks hypothetical, or is there actually an impact on the business?
Actually, wonderful question, and Debu, thank you for leading us down this path. So, with regards to the errors themselves, when you're thinking about how this applies to the enterprise, there is first, one distinction that I want to make, which is that enterprises especially in this Gen AI environment, they will probably use foundational models that are either, publicly available, meaning, stuff like what OpenAI might be able to provide to enterprises. And then over a period of time, more and more enterprises might even choose to go with private LLMs. But really, where the risk starts to come in for the enterprise themselves, while the OpenAIs of the world think through how they're training their foundational models, that's one entirely different level of risk and where responsible AI should be practiced. There's another entire segment where these enterprises need to think about how they're actually using this. So some of the places that they have to think about this is, they have to be able to first figure out what are the sources of data, the underlying data sets on which these enterprises are looking to do some sort of analysis or get recommendations or get insights or suggested actions. If they are, publicly available documents, that's one thing, the level of risk is low. If they are business documents, corporate documents, all of that tends to be on the lower side of the risk. However, as you get more and more sophisticated and the kinds of models that you're building start to work with personally identifiable information, obviously you can see how the risk ratchets up. So the sources of data and what they contain, that presents one dimension of risk. Another dimension of risk is the way that the outputs of these AI products, these AI applications within the enterprise are consumed. Are they being consumed by, in the forms of reports or in the forms of suggested next actions? In those cases, you have the ability for people to add caveats around it, or to be able to be sensitized to how this needs to have a human in the loop before further action is taken. On the other hand, if you progress further down and you make this sort of decision making or interfacing with the AI via chatbot, then suddenly some of those caveats start to evaporate. People are more used to instantaneous answers, and they're taking an action based on what AI is suggesting, whereas they might not know that there was no human in the loop that actually oversaw this. So that's another gradient, right? The way in which the outputs are being consumed by people. And the third one is the audience. So is the AI output being given to people that are internal business users, people that have been educated about the limitations of such and such AI data product or AI application? Or are they external business users where the organization might be interfacing with other businesses, in which case, again, the other business partners that might be looking at this AI output, they might not have been sensitized to where this is coming from. So, the risk starts to go up. And finally, if it's the laity, the public, like you and I, who are talking to an AI agent and not knowing it, that risk goes up even more significantly. So these are the dimensions through which an organization needs to think about, when they're applying AI at the enterprise, where the risk for not being responsible in how they're actually deploying it starts to surface.
Great, thank you, Indra. Venkata, anything to add? Venkata, you're on mute.
Let me riff off what Debu said, right? That product and application is the construct around which a lot of this conversation is revolving, because that is really the touch point of whoever is the consumer. Now, what is really happening is that first of all, the number of data products, even in HR, the area that Debu talked about, there are 10x more applications. And secondly, there are sources that historically we have not used. Indra was mentioning about these private confidential business documents. Now, all of them are being brought into the purview of these products. Earlier, these products used to touch only the database. The third thing that is actually happening is that the user's behavior themselves is changing from being just a dashboard consumer or very simple user to power users. So the regime, essentially, the application regime is fundamentally changing. As a result, even if there were hidden risks in the past, like the ones that Debu was talking about, a hard-coded rule and so on, not only they are coming to the fore, but a number of new risks are also coming to the fore, and a lot of this is uncertain because of the complexity of the data systems that we have been building for the past 10 years or so. So it's a fairly uncharted territory from that perspective, but and therefore there is a need for both at a conceptual level, at a principle level, understanding the responsible AI, but also equally thinking in terms of actionables, tools, methods, processes as well.
Thanks, Venkata. So what I'm hearing you all say is that there are some very clear risk vectors, and as Indra pointed them out, it could be about sources of data, how it's being used, and so on and so forth. But Venkata, I think you raised an important point about there being lots of uncertainty in this space. As systems become more complex, there are going to be new risks, and I think it's just going to be an evolving process of being able to identify and mitigate these risks. But Debu, I want to come back to the point that you made, right, about why trust is so important in this entire ecosystem with all of this uncertainty around risk management. You have to be transparent, right? So I can go through, and I really want to jump to now some very practical solutions to how to deal with these issues, and just a laundry list of potential issues that enterprise companies are going to be dealing with as they deploy AI. It's going to be about protecting privacy and confidentiality of information, about ensuring fairness, equality, and so on, especially if there's decision making involved, ensuring accuracy of information, protecting the IP rights of third parties, right? So several, I think, specific issues that we can pick on. But if I can take a step back, Debu, at a macro level, the point you raised about transparency, I can imagine that getting different departments within a large organization on board with something as fundamental as transparency is going to be a challenge. So can you, maybe based on your current engagements with these companies, or even perhaps your engagements, your experience at ServiceNow or Oracle, what does it take to align an organization's values with some of these responsible AI principles? And is that a good place to start before we get into actual specific implementation issues?
That you're asking a very, very important question. In fact, that question is actually the genesis of my current company, right? Essentially, what we are trying to do is bring a way to operationalize governance for organizations. The challenge in AI with the AI system, and compared to any other systems like a transactional system, like a database system or a search system, is the fact that AI ecosystem is actually built by multiple peoples. Like there are folks who are working in the data land, like they are actually creating the data. They are then the feature engineers who are creating feature sets, and then on top of that, models get built. And the models, some models are generic but used in different ways, different application. For example, a chatbot. Right, a chatbot is really today a chatbot can build out of a large language foundational model and can do every kind of dialogue flow in the chatbot. But before a generation before that, when I the kind of things which we did in ServiceNow, where we had essentially 5 or 6 different models, like that a language understanding model, a sentiment understanding model, we had an intent understanding model, we had an entity understanding model, we had a search model, we had a categorization model, catalog. So those, the fact that you are building so many things in different groups, and they all have to kind of follow the same principles of governance, or what do you call it, like regulations didn't exist. Regulations still don't exist. They are in the kind of directives which comes in, but eventually regulations will come in, and people will, and all software will have AI in it, which essentially means that all software will have to conform to these regulations in some form or other. So you need to have a ability for every such stakeholder to understand what these governance principles are. So, and there are multiple stakeholders now. So we're not talking about data engineers, model engineers, and application builders. We're also talking about people who are provisioning these things, right? And they go and build into, so there's ops guys involved, there are security guys involved, from who are opening up ports, and who are now models never can, and models are going to get subsumed by inference services calling large language models somewhere else, right? So so the complexity of this AI ecosystem is growing, and if you don't have a notion of a governance playbook which has to be created for the organization, then everybody cannot march to the same tune. And then now you're bringing in a series of folks like from the legal and compliance side of the house, who are other stakeholders in this organization. And you have got to operationalize the entire process out, right? You have to kind of help the legal and compliance folks come up with the governance playbook and run the governance playbook. People in the design side of the house, or people in the procurement side. Not all software is designed internally. Some software is procured by other companies. Those procured software ought to follow the same governance principles of your company, because essentially they will be adding risk, as Indrayudh said. You are adding risk to your company. So the risks need to be evaluated based on your governance principles, not on the governance principles of the company producing the software. So that's the challenge of operationalizing governance, and it includes a variety of players, and everybody ought to have the same view of the world, right? If I understand fairness, I have to understand fairness in the same context. If I have to understand transparency, I understand transparency in the same context. And it also just not the operational. What are you going to operationalize on? So which means that you have to understand, you have to get the visibility of where all the AI assets exist. So you need to know where all models are being developed, or data sets are being used, which are applications using AI, procured or unprocured. So visibility into this is extremely important. And then you can run the governance principle playbook, and then you can also measure your risk, and you can run and ensure that you are complying to the regulations, and prioritizing the set of gaps which you have, and only working on the ones which makes most sense.
Yeah, thanks, Debu.
But it's probably
no, I think
fine.
I think very valuable. I think this idea of a governance playbook, I think, really strikes me as something that could be useful in terms of interdepartmental conversations, aligning different parts of the organization on specific values. Venkata, if I could come to you, I think Debu made this point about the increasing complexity of these AI systems, and it seems hard enough to get different parts of an organization aligned on questions of fairness and equality and things of that nature. But of course, the AI value chain operates in very different ways, right? There are multiple parties, and as we are moving to, for example, the use of APIs and system integrators, what do downstream entities need to do to ensure compliance as well, right? So if I were to put it to you differently, what does responsible AI look like on the other side of that enterprise, including for folks like you who are using APIs, helping companies customize and deploy foundational models? Any thoughts on that?
No, two, 3 thoughts. I was going to first react to Debu's point about a organization level coherence, right? Or syncing up with this larger set of principles. And I think that because people are operating at many levels of abstraction, somebody who's provisioning the server all the way to somebody who's just an Excel user, one of the big challenges that the community has overall is to be able to translate that larger goal into something that is task or role or function level abstraction. Otherwise, what does it mean, right? I'm doing just feature engineering. How is that related to me? So I think there is a very significant gap. There is a missing conversation here overall in the community in terms of a step down framework from the high level to the low level abstraction. But let me step back a little bit, right? So you as an enterprise are ultimately on the hook to comply to this. Your governance framework should include in anywhere where your data goes or comes, if you will. So if you are sourcing some outputs from OpenAI, then that better be part of your consideration framework. You may have judgments about how good it is, whether it is consistent, better, worse than what you have, and so on. But because that now the AI, the ecosystem itself is fairly distributed. You have many services that operate on many different parts of the data, and the complexity is everywhere. So you can't have a command and control view of this whole thing, right? It needs to be a lot more distributed. It needs to be a lot more discovery oriented, and so on, right? And it has to cover anything that where your data goes, if you will, right? Both into the business processes as well as from the supply side. But I want to step back and talk about one thing, right? Which is that the fundamental problem that enterprises face today is not that they would not like to be very responsible, or they don't understand, they don't have a sense of responsibility, but really it's a resource question. There is only X amount of bandwidth that is available in the enterprises, and that is already operating at max capacity. Most data teams are actually quite small, the power users of the data. And now we are adding a very significant new task responsibility to them, many questions of which are very open-ended. For example, fairness question it's a fairly open-ended question. It's almost researchy in its flavor. So one of the missing frameworks, I believe, is an economics framework. Given that you have a diverse set of challenges to meet our objectives of being responsible, what is a way by which we allocate resources within the company and prioritize our work so that we are able to continuously make focus? Otherwise, you can be paralyzed if you start with very high level goals. And there are a few ideas. We will talk about them. We have been discussing that with some of our customers and peers in the community and so on. Let me give you one idea, right? What we call as the maximum plus peak approach. So if you think of an enterprise risk landscape, right? You can think of peaks of risk and a plane of risk and so on. So at least we know that you can't be completely driven by the peak only approach, right? Because there are small use cases or small applications where there is enormous amount of risk, but there is small risk distributed across all of your products. So at least there are methods that are differentiated in terms of their impact. Some of them are about acuteness of the risk. Some of them are about improving the overall hygiene or maximizing the minimum standards of the entire organization. There are several ideas that are floating around, and these all need to be intensely discussed and fleshed out to provide a way by which resources can be allocated to this task.
No, thanks, Venkata. I think just Indra, before I hand it over to you, I think this point you mentioned about bandwidth constraints and resource constraint, I think just looking at that, and I agree with you, and then looking at the fact that Scribble's really paying close attention to responsible AI, I think that itself speaks to, I think, how important this is an issue it is for you, and that you're taking it up, I think is quite commendable. Yeah, over to you, Indra.
Thanks, Amlan. I know that a bunch of people that have registered and are attending this particular webinar have come because of much more recent advances, very LLM-focused advances, and the kinds of risks that LLMs themselves bring up beyond AI as a broader topic. So keeping that in mind, one of the things that we wanted to talk about is privacy when it comes to working with LLMs. So I know that there are business stakeholders who think about their particular pain points, the ones that they're looking to solve with Gen AI. And of course, that usually has all of the other components as well. No good problem is going to be only LLM focused. It'll have machine learning, it'll have data pre-processing, feature engineering, all of that good stuff. But when it comes to the LLM, there's a lot of sensitivity around that, because that is where the world got introduced to hallucinations and the like. They also got introduced to what happens when data leaves my system. So I'd love to be able to talk a little bit about how enterprises think about selecting the right LLMs based on the context of their use cases and what that means from a privacy perspective, how LLM providers are addressing those kinds of concerns. The second thing is obviously once we get past the actual context of the use case, then we also have to contend with emerging AI regulations the world over. Different geographies are coming up with their own regulations around what it means to be responsible and to be able to demonstrate that. So that is the second layer that we have to think about. And finally, even after the considerations of the particular organization and the particular use case, and then of any geographically imposed considerations are addressed, there will be so many other stakeholders who are going to be recipients of the outputs of these AI data products that will then be involved, and they will have their own considerations as well. So, Amlan, I'd like to invite you to just give our audience today an understanding of how some of the top LLM providers are thinking through data privacy and what they're talking about in terms of how to make this available for the enterprise.
Sure, thanks, Indra. The way that I thought I'd approach this is to have some questions up on the screen and to take you through some examples based on my review of some of the privacy policies of some of the most prominent LLM providers that we have in the market today. So you'll see up there are 6 questions focused on, for example, what issues of data classifications and data categorization, how different types of data are regulated or protected under these privacy policies, questions of data ownership, questions of storage and retention, questions of accessibility, and of course, larger questions of data security. So if you could just move to the next slide. I'd love to start with a question on fundamentally what types of data are protected when you're dealing with, in some way, interacting with an LLM service provider. The shot, and you'll see up on the screen, I have from the left to the right, increasing sensitivity of data, right? Anonymized data is essentially a category of data which regulators consider to be low risk, whereas on the right extreme, you have sensitive personal data, which could, for example, include biometric data or health or financial data, which is treated as a special category of information that requires a higher degree of protection. Now, from my analysis of LLM policies, what I find is actually it's only personal data and sensitive personal data that is really protected under their privacy policies. And of course, it's understandable why this is so. A lot of the privacy policies, whether of LLM providers or any other organizations, are derived from data protection regulations. So the GDPR, for example, only recognizes personal data. And if you could just go to the next slide, you'll see there are some very specific examples of personal data that an LLM privacy policy like Azure's OpenAI model would protect. So you'll see it's pretty broad definition. It means any information relating to an natural person, and you'll see it includes biometric information, location data, device information, and that's all good and sundry. But again, if you just go back to the last slide, I really want to focus on the previous slide. Yeah, this slide. I want to focus on what's not in green, right? And that includes anonymized data, de-identified data, inferred data, increasingly important types of data which people are using, which could come, for example, generated from machines. It could be customer information that's aggregated at population scale. So I really want to spend some time asking customers to pay a little bit attention to how data is classified and protected across the entire value chain. You'll see a few slides later, I have a specific example of, if you could just move to the next slide. Yes, you'll see, for example, there are complications in privacy policies. This is OpenAI essentially saying that we can continue to process information that has been de-identified or anonymized. And you'll see what the purpose of that is to improve OpenAI systems. So if I were to ask you, is anonymized customer data really protected? I pointed to this privacy policy and then raise that question. If we can move to the next question on data ownership, I think this is one of those questions that's much more abstract and philosophical than we currently, I think, understand. Right? It's quite clear data is nothing like oil, despite lots of people claiming that is the case. It's infinite, it's non-rivalrous, it's reusable, which is why I think this question of data ownership becomes fundamental. Right? You'll see on the left, you have OpenAI claiming that you own your data, and I see many people making this claim as well. What I would say is, I think just question that assertion that data is yours to own, because what my understanding it is, based on a review of several privacy policies, is that this question of data ownership is an evolving concept from the way that regulators are thinking about it. If anything, there is a very close relationship between data and intellectual property rights, and actual proprietary rights in the way that intellectual property rights like copyright or patent provide are closer to ownership models than data protection rights under the GDPR are. So as these regulatory frameworks around non-personal data, around data ownership evolve, I would say be very careful and carefully scrutinize some of these claims around data ownership. If you can move to the next slide, is really a question about how data is used. And I think the top question on everyone's mind when it comes to enterprise use cases is my data going to be used to train the underlying foundation model? And happy to say that based on my review of some of these privacy policies, it appears that most LLMs provide adequate protection on this front. Essentially, they say that your data will not be used for training of our models. But keep in mind, this is a fairly recent phenomenon. If you see, for example, OpenAI, this was only earlier this year where they actually made it an opt-in system that you could opt in to training your models through customer data, whereas a few months ago, it was actually opt-out. So again, something to note, this is an evolving space. And while current practices and policies guarantee that no data will be used to train models, I think, again, this is something that compliance teams need to very carefully analyze. Related to that, I think this question is, what other rights do LLM providers and other parts of the AI value chain have with respect to data that you provide to them? And I'd just like to talk a little bit about some of these concepts. Collection limitation, of course, is what type of data that they're able to collect from you. And of course, these can be constrained through technical measures. Purpose limitation is essentially contractual protections that you might have with third parties to say you can only use the data for X and Y purpose. For example, LLM models typically use your data for trust and safety purposes, for content filtering to ensure that there is no unlawful content if it is a consumer-facing product. And then, of course, there's legitimate interest, which is a concept in the GDPR, which essentially says that some companies can use personal data for other unrelated purposes without the consent of the user. Typically, this involves security reasons. It could also include, for example, marketing purposes. So I would, again, caution people to be very careful about how collection purpose limitations and legitimate interest is mentioned in privacy policies and your vendor agreements. I think another key issue I want to focus on is who can access your data, so questions of accessibility, and where that information is stored. Again, you'll see a lot of models talk a little bit about the fact that these are your data stored in isolated environments. Of course, there's this question of whether it's on-prem, remote, or hybrid, and we can talk about this in our upcoming session on technical guardrails. But I think really important to talk about who can access that data. Is it authorized employees of the LLM provider only? In what situations can law enforcement officials access your data? Are there situations, are there exceptions to some of these safeguards in place? And more broadly, what are the access, technical or organizational access controls that third parties have when it comes to dealing with your data? The other question when it comes to, if you could just go back to the previous slide, when it comes to storage, I would say, I think fundamentally the question of location of data storage is very important. Increasingly, some jurisdictions have data localization norms. So I think really important to understand whether some of these models are going to be able to comply with data localization requirements that your organization might be subject to. The last piece that I want to talk about is, of course, fundamentally data security. And again, happy to note that on most fronts, these models have industry grade high-level security practices, so nothing really to worry about. The only question I will flag is around the future of encryption. There have been a lot of discussions in different jurisdictions where regulators are trying to compromise encryptions for national security purposes. So I think really important to keep in mind whether an enterprise use case of encryption is protected under these evolving regulations. With that, I just want to wrap up this presentation, but really open the floor for a quick discussion on this. And Debu, if I can come to you, I know you've been working, of course, in privacy and security issues. Sorry, Venkata, was that? Did you have a comment?
So many thoughts here at the intersection of GRC and the privacy policy. For example, today the GRC systems do not automatically parse these policies of third-party APIs or third-party models in order to know whether there is any disconnect between your own posture and this third party. I was wondering if that's a conversation that is happening in the GRC community, and where Debu sees this coherence across policies of multiple players in the ecosystem going.
Yeah, actually, that is a big challenge, and I think I took down a few points from your earlier statement, and one of the things you mentioned was that there is an economic issue or aspect or quantification of all the things we do, a set of challenges when we are handling with this. So you don't want this governance and all to be burden on the already a challenge set of folks trying to produce something, right? Essentially, that's why the thing we need to prioritize between how much resources we have and all the things you have to do compared to product building versus making compliant and government. And none of these privacy laws or GDPR data laws or other industry laws. The industry laws exist too in the US, for example, SEC, FTC. In fact, OpenAI is being sued by FTC. It's nothing to do with AI regulations. The questions being sent to OpenAI has been sent by FTC. If we look at the set of questions, they actually fall under the various categories of fairness, transparency, security, robustness, which is classically the 10 areas which we have identified as areas under which governance control questions can be created out of the various acts which are coming out from the national bodies or the industry statutory bodies, right? So the fact that you have to comply to many of these things. So essentially, if you have the ability to take these compliance regulations and convert them into a set of factors or topics, and which control questions can be created, and the control question can then now be mapped into multiple such regulations, and these control questions can be answered from the data which you already have. In fact, and I think you mentioned it here too before, that most people want to do the right things, right? When I'm running engineering and stuff, we actually do not want to do bad things. We actually want to do the right things away. And most of the information may actually exist. It may exist in design spec, test specs, function specs, which is what gives me the information for how to even say that I'm responsible, I'm doing the right things. But we are not bring it out in a way which other people can see, right? Which is also on the part of transparency, which again boils down to trust, right? We are tying all of them together now in an operational fashion. So if a product can do that, GRC product can actually do that, and without asking more and more from the stakeholders. If the stakeholders were developers, it could be the security guys, it could be the folks who are provisioning, and you can do it automatically using more of LLMs now involved in doing this thing for you. Then actually you're using LLMs to improving the entire ability of the entire the developer community and the other stakeholders to actually use AI to improve the business functions and the productivity of the company without adding additional tasks and resources, challenges to the resources which are already strapped to do more.
I think given that there is so much amount of knowledge about the systems, about the data lying all over the place, right? Whether it is in Excel sheets or whether it is in PowerPoints, design documents, and so on, there is definitely a place for an intelligent GRC system to actually combine all of these to give a meaningful, already pre-cooked information, so that they don't have to go searching. Machine is very good at doing all of these kinds of mechanical stuff at scale. So I definitely see a huge need, especially because documenting a data set is something that nobody wants to do. Metadata is not nobody wants to spend.
But metadata exists in some, and so you discover the metadata, isn't it? And you read that to run the compliance, run it against the governance playbook and make sure that you're compliant. It actually does doing the work. In fact, what you're saying is what we do, and the entire Konfer's work is to ensure that we are we simplify this, reimagine GRC, simplify the entire work of doing governance and compliance, but do it at no extra cost to an extra burden to the folks who are already involved, who have to provide the information. Literally, this is the thesis of the company, and this is how you build the product out. And we do, we use a lot of LLMs to help do that. And we want to be transparent too. So our use of LLMs will be documented the way we expect other people to do their work for other business functions which they're doing.
Yeah, almost.
Let me quickly get in a point for all of our attendees. Do note that you can ask your questions using the Q&A function within the larger Zoom call. As you tack them in there, we'll start addressing them. But I have a question now for Amlan. Amlan, there's been a gestation period now that people have seen starting out with ChatGPT, and now there are mandates that company X has to start adopting and integrating AI into their roadmap. So very soon, compliance teams are going to have to put on a hat that they never donned before, which is, all right, so what do we do? How do we gear up for this? And obviously, one of the places they look for is emerging AI regulations. So if you can just give us a sense about how the regulatory landscape is evolving in this space, and how compliance teams can start to take a leaf out of that playbook and start thinking about what they need to do.
Sure, Indra, happy to. I think really important question. But I will caveat that to say that as these AI regulatory frameworks are evolving, in the EU with the Draft AI Act, in China with the GenAI guidelines, in the US, of course, with these voluntary commitments, you can see there are different approaches to AI regulation. But I think I want to touch on something Debu said earlier, actually, right? Which is that the FTC's questionnaire to OpenAI actually deal with current regulation. So I think really there's a conversation happening right now across different countries about how existing regulation should be applied to AI systems, whether it is about recruitment and labor laws or about privacy laws, and so on and so forth. So I think regulators are getting up to speed, building internal capacity, thinking about how they should be applied and who should be applying them. And I think compliance teams should be paying very close attention to mapping how their existing AI systems or proposed AI systems map onto existing rules and regulations and making sure they're compliant with that. I would say that's priority. And then as things evolve, I think to think through, again, a checklist framework essentially of what your proposed use case is, where you fall on that risk assessment framework. So I'll just point to a blog post that I've written on the Scribble Data blog, providing some guidance on some of these questions. The EU, for example, has a very prescriptive framework about if you fall within a specific use case, you need to do X, Y, Z. Some countries like the UK, the India seem to be adopting a more pro-innovation, first principles-based approach. And so on and so forth. So I think different countries are adopting different strategies. It's worth, I think, paying attention to each of those things and having a checklist in place being able to address risks as much as possible, and in cases, and there will be gray areas. I think that's really the takeaway. I feel like there is going to be a period of uncertainty. Being able to identify those areas, for example, it could be around data ownership, it could be about data sharing or encryption use, and I think being able to mitigate those risks as far as possible, I think, should be again a key task for compliance teams.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Venkata, if I can just, sorry, you wanted to add a point to this?
Yes.
So I just wanted to add a point. In fact, it's interesting, like, NIST is not NIST is a body for standard body producing, and they produce a framework with with 3 stools on which this entire governance stuff starts, like called, map, measure, and manage. We actually found out that we actually realized that it is a new way of thinking about GRC. Map really maps onto governance. Measure is really what you get risk out of it. So you can only if you measure, then you can create the risk, and then you can prioritize the risk as a $1 risk, or $1 million risk, or $1 billion risk to your company, and then you work. Then you try to manage it, and which is basically manage it to the risk as well as to the compliance or the regulations which your industry or your organization are subject to, and this is where not only the AI regulations come in, but also the industry regulations. It could be FTC, it could be SEC, it could be CFPB, it could be a variety. And in fact, for insurance industry, the insurance are regulated by states. So every state will have a regulation, and you have to follow the state regulations. So it's a huge burden of these things which come in. But the fact is, this is map, measure, manage from NIST. It's really is a new way of thinking about what GRC should be doing. Reimagining the way of GRC should work.
So one challenge I've been mulling about, but haven't arrived at any conclusion yet, is that from our experience, it is becoming clearer and clearer that like sand, the AI will be pretty much everywhere, in every organization, every corner. Now, my challenge with even the regulatory folks who are getting up to speed on all of these things is that the surface area that they need to now govern is so huge that if there is one corner case application in one corner of some unknown company, how much of this can be truly governed, and how much of it has to be built into our culture itself, culture of self-discipline, control, and also the values and so on. I don't see the legalese percolating to every nook and corner, because the applications that customers are talking to us about were things that they themselves were not thinking 12 months from now, and they're literally hunting for use cases across the length and breadth. What about the incompleteness of the coverage of some of these the legal governance, whether it is at a regulatory framework or within the company? Any thoughts?
Venkat, actually, I want to take you in the opposite direction right now, rather than leaving people on that desolate note. If you move away from the compliance folks who are trying to sort of put these guardrails around how organizations should think, they're probably going to be executives who actually have pain points, whose imaginations have been sparked by ChatGPT, and then thinking, okay, this is how I'm going to apply it to my business. But before they get fired for bringing AI into the organization, how should executives with those pain points, with those use cases, think about what is the first few things that they should think about from a responsible AI perspective?
So we have had many conversations, right, around this, and a few things are emerging from that. The first one is that it's like a muscle that the organization has to build over a period of time. It's not that one day you will magically come up with the tools, processes, methods for all of this. So start narrow, start simple, and so on. That equally a big thing is to get into the trenches. So when Debu talks about transparency and trust and all of those kinds of things, these have to cut deep into the organization. My job partly involves talking to a lot of data scientists day in and day out, right? For them, all of this is actually quite removed from their day-to-day life. So one of the active things for the executives, beyond starting narrow, starting simple, and crawl, walk, run philosophy overall, is to now set expectations from the data teams and anybody who is touching and feeling the data and transforming the data and so on, because we know the considerations for this class of folks is very different. And so the second thing I would encourage these executives is to talk to their folks in the trenches, engineers especially, and set expectations of transparency, that you will be audited. Your model, your data, every questions will be asked that will cut deep into their work. So that is the second one. And the one consequence of that is that the last few years, they have been going down the path of building ever more complex models, processes, workflows within the tech stack itself. So if something has to be auditable and it needs to be auditable all the time and so on, you have to necessarily simplify the things. And the last thing is, if you're not sure, Copilot is the way to go. Human supervision is a necessary step before you get into full automation. Automation looks great. Agents is a great conversation to have between engineers, but it is not the right thing for the organization. The activity has to be governed, and it is governed using tools, using processes, and so on. So the third thing is that if whoever is building these data products have to necessarily start with a Copilot mode of operation before they get into more hyper automated form of execution.
Yeah, I think what's implicit in everything that you said is proactive stance, meaning start with responsible AI. It is not something that you want to react to, because by then the horse would have bolted from the barn. So you start by bringing all of the players to the table. You even have the uncomfortable conversations with compliance, letting them know what you're building, just because you don't want to get derailed at the end stage. Cool. Thank you so much, Venkata. Amlan, why don't I hand it over to you to help us summarize some of our takeaways?
Sure, thanks, Siddharth. Before I do that, I do see a question from one of our participants. So I thought that's something that we can have the panelists address. This is a question that's coming in from Raj, and I think it touches a little bit, Venkata, on what you said. Essentially, the question from Raj is, when you're dealing with AI-generated content and making decisions on the basis of content generated by AI, how should your thinking change, right? Compared to, for example, how you'd make a decision based on a report prepared by a human intern, right? So is that something that you need to think about or do differently as you're thinking about decisions made based on AI-generated content as opposed to human-generated content? I guess this is open to everyone, but Venkata, maybe we can start with you. But I don't know, I see Indra as well.
I do have a thought, but I would love to hear Debu's and Indra's take on it as well. Everybody now, given the amount of the proliferation of all of this, the working assumption is don't trust anything that you see. We just saw yesterday's the hoopla around the hospital and so on, right? Now there are mechanisms to amplify any bit of content in an explosive fashion, and machines are very good at generating viral content. So the working assumption is trust but verify, right? If there's no verification, there's no trust. So a very defensive posture, a very conservative posture is required across the board. We moved from a world which was primarily signal and some noise to primary noise and some signal.
Yeah.
Debu, go ahead, please.
Yeah, sure. So this is a very important aspect of creating an application which will make a decision, right? At the end of the day, there has to be some amount of label set, right, which allows you to verify that the information is correct and based on what the intended context of the application model used inside the application is. Now there are tools. There are actually products which we are building out which try to observe drift, right? And many of our model and the drift can actually percolate. It's like it's like an error if for people who have done numerical methods in engineering, a small error can actually create a large amplify into a large error depending on how the error propagates through that system. So you can catch that drift early in the process if you have the ability to observe what the inputs are compared to the inputs on which you have tested. So if the inputs are changing, then the model may or may not be able to react to it in the process. And in fact, from a compliance point of view, I believe, if I'm not that EU AI regulations asks for a kill switch functionality, and the kill switch functionality is exactly at that point when if you end up finding the answers are drifting more than what you expected, you ought to probably go back to our old rules-based system, and default to it while you figure out what changes you need to do in your running ecosystem with the models, and bring it back to what it should be doing. It's like old controls theory, limit and error coming into the even in an automated decisioning system. So this is the way you catch it.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
The only revision I have for that is that not all applications are created equal. So there are public-facing chat-oriented conversations. There are lots of non-chat-oriented applications of LLMs and so on. So all judgments about what your approach should be for a given class of problems should depend upon your assessment of the risk and the impact of a given situation. So kill switch may be appropriate for something like Microsoft's bot chatting with folks on Twitter, whereas if you are doing a simple workflow automation internally where there is a human in the loop, then it looks very, very different. But in all cases, you can't skip the step of actually assessing this system for correctness overall.
Yeah. I'll add one more point here, which is that, one place, and it requires intentionality on the part of the engineering teams. One place where AI can help is actually make that verification process in the trust but verify a lot easier. It can point you to how it came up with whatever recommendation or next step very quickly. It can take you very quickly to how it came up with that. So if you're able to do that trust but verify well, because the engineering team built the system to allow for that, then the second thing that you could do, and again, the engineering team would be involved, is provide feedback to the system so that over a period of time, the system is getting better and better. And if you're able to do this, this is what will enable us to go from crawl to walk to run.
Yeah, correct. Good point.
Yeah, thank you, folks. I think we ended with a very specific set of practical tips and strategies, which I think will be really helpful. I thought since we have a minute or two left, I could spend a little bit of time maybe summarizing some of the key takeaways that I thought from this entire discussion. So firstly, thank you again, Indra, Venkata, Debu, for all of your insights. I think when we started, we really wanted to understand this question of risk assessment, right, and risk mitigation, essentially. And I think where we arrived at is that I think at this point, we have to assume that trust is important, and there are different ways in which we can achieve that trust. Debu spoke a little bit about transparency, and of course, there are different paths to achieve that trust. But I think at this point, we recognize that responsible AI, as we understand it, is just one way in which we can help achieve some of that trust. The second, I think, important takeaway that we landed on was the complexity of the system, right? And this is in terms of technical complexity, but also regulatory complexity. And increasingly, I think this is going to be an important issue of governance and building these governance frameworks, right? Venkata, you mentioned this idea about we're operating at different levels of abstraction. So how do we get some of these values to trickle down across the entire value chain? And I thought that was a really important point. And I think when we were talking specifically about privacy, Debu, you mentioned this framework around map, measure, and manage that comes from the NIST framework that could be useful for compliance teams as they think through setting up specific compliance processes right now. We concluded, I think, with some very specific practical measures around setting expectations, around looking at human interventions, about explainability and building in feedback, as Indra mentioned. But I think what really for me the takeaway was is how can we put this all together in the form of a governance playbook that can be used across the organization, right, to build this muscle, as you said, Venkata. And I think, I'd like to just stop with that as a takeaway. It's something that I know Scribble Data is thinking about putting out at the conclusion of these conversations, a playbook to help people, teams comply. And I'm looking forward to looking at that as well. So with that, thank you everyone for participating in this. There is another conversation that's happening next week. If you enjoyed this conversation, you'd like to share a copy of this video with people that you think might be interested in this, please ask them to register and we'll mail them a copy as well. Hope to see you soon. Thank you again, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.